Some were rushed, others were reckless. But all of them had one thing in common. They never should have made it to the road. Exploding tanks, collapsing frames, deadly design flaws. These cars weren't just dangerous. They were an embarrassment. This is the dark side of American auto history. And yes, they were real. The 1974-1979 Triumph TR7 was marketed as the shape of things to come, a bold proclamation that, in hindsight, might have been more of a warning than a promise. Designed during a turbulent time for British Leyland, the TR7 was supposed to be a revolutionary step forward, a clean-slate sports car for a new era, complete with a radical wedge profile, pop-up headlights, and a fixed-roof coupe layout aimed at modernizing the classic British roadster formula. But in practice, it ended up as one of the most infamous examples of unreliability, cost-cutting, and corporate dysfunction in the annals of British motoring. The styling, penned by Harris Mann, was polarizing from the start. While some admired the futuristic wedge design, others mourned the death of the curvaceous, elegant lines that had defined British sports cars of the 1960s. Gone were the flowing fenders and chrome accents of the TR6. In their place was a flat-faced, sharply creased shell that looked more like a concept car from a 1970s sci-fi flick than something you'd want to drive daily. And while it certainly turned heads, the design aged poorly, especially when paired with cheap interior plastics and mismatched trim. Mechanically, the TR7 was plagued from birth. The early models were built at British Leyland's Speak factory in Liverpool, a plant known for its labor disputes, quality control issues, and abysmal morale. Workers there, often underpaid and overworked, were reportedly assembling cars with indifference, or in some cases outright sabotage. As a result, early TR7s earned a reputation for self-destructing in the most British way possible, with a whimper and a cloud of blue smoke. Under the hood was a 2.0L inline-four derived from the Dolomite, which on paper wasn't bad, but real-world performance was sluggish, especially compared to what American buyers expected from their sports cars. More damning, the engine was known for overheating thanks to poor cooling system design, faulty head gaskets, and radiators that would clog themselves solid in summer traffic. Long road trips could easily turn into tow truck adventures. The car's electrical system, sourced in part from Lucas, the so-called Prince of Darkness, was the source of constant headaches. Owners often found themselves battling a seemingly possessed machine, headlights that wouldn't pop up or stay down, wipers that worked only during droughts, turn signals that blinked out of sync, and most famously, ignitions that failed entirely. One TR7 owner bitterly recalled, "The ignition fried itself on day 3, got stuck in the rain with no lights, no wipers, no nothing." That kind of experience wasn't rare. It was practically a rite of passage. Then there were the doors, which became infamous for jamming shut during even minor accidents. Triumph engineers apparently hadn't accounted for chassis flex or panel misalignment that could lock occupants inside after a bump. In a crash, the car became a trap, and more than one unfortunate driver had to climb out the window like they were escaping a submarine. Needless to say, safety wasn't a strong point, and the car's crash structure, while modern in concept, was never fully proven in practice. The suspension and handling were a mixed bag. With its front-engine rear-drive layout and relatively low weight, the TR7 should have been a nimble corner carver. But vague steering, unpredictable handling, and a harsh ride meant that even when the car was running, it rarely felt planted or confidence-inspiring. Autocrossers and rally fans tried to coax performance from it. Indeed, the later V8-powered TR8 proved the chassis had potential. But in stock form, the TR7 drove more like a tired commuter car than a spirited sports coupe. To make matters worse, British Leyland's decision to release the coupe version first, with the convertible not appearing until years later, further alienated traditional sports car fans. Americans, in particular, had a long-standing love affair with open-top British roadsters, and the lack of a drop-top version early on led many to pass it by. When the convertible finally did appear in 1979, it was too late to change the car's reputation. By the end of the 1970s, the TR7 was the punchline of jokes across both sides of the Atlantic. It symbolized everything that had gone wrong with British automotive engineering during the era. Brilliant ideas undermined by poor execution, shoddy materials, and rushed production. Even though over 100,000 units were eventually sold, mostly in the US, the majority of them were either scrapped, cannibalized for parts, or left to rot in driveways and barns. And yet, there's a strange affection for the TR7 in some corners of the classic car world today. Perhaps it's nostalgia for a weird era, or maybe it's the tragic charm of a car that tried so hard to be the future and ended up a footnote instead. The later V8-powered TR8 in particular has gained something of a cult following. The 1970-1974 Citroën SM was, in many ways, one of the most astonishing cars ever to come out of France, or anywhere. A rolling sculpture on wheels, it fused futuristic styling, advanced engineering, and otherworldly comfort into a single machine. Designed during Citroën's boldest and most experimental period, the SM was the spiritual successor to the legendary DS, only more luxurious, more powerful, and far more complicated. And that last point would ultimately become its undoing. Visually, the SM looked like something from a Jetsons meets 1970s Riviera fever dream. Its long, tapered nose housed 6 headlights behind a curved glass cover. In Europe, anyway, US laws required a clunkier, sealed beam setup, while its sleek, fastback profile ended in a high cam tail with wraparound glass and no visible rear bumper. The whole thing sat low and wide on Michelin radial tires, shod in partially covered wheels. It wasn't just a car, it was a design statement, a mobile art installation that whispered La Révolution Mécanique at every turn. Underneath that beauty, though, was a machine so complex and delicate that it scared off even seasoned mechanics. At its heart was a 2.7-liter Maserati V6. Later versions had a 3.0-liter, a product of Citroën's acquisition of the Italian brand in the late 1960s. The engine was light, high-revving, and exotic, just like the car itself, but it required constant maintenance, used timing chains that needed precise tensioning, and was packed tightly into the engine bay, making even basic tasks like changing the spark plugs a multi-hour ordeal. And that was just the beginning. The SM's real claim to fame was its fully integrated hydraulic system, adapted from the DS but taken to a new level. The car featured hydropneumatic suspension that could self-level and adjust ride height on the fly, giving it an uncannily smooth ride. Its brakes were also hydraulically actuated, with no mechanical fallback, and featured a mushroom-style brake pedal with no travel, just pressure sensitivity, which made modulation a learned art form. Steering? Also hydraulic, but not like anything else on the market. The SM featured Daihatsu steering, a system that provided fully variable assistance based on speed and had a self-centering function that felt downright eerie. At parking speeds, you could spin the wheel with one finger. At highway speeds, the system firmed up and resisted sudden inputs, giving it a stability that rivaled locomotives. But if any single hydraulic line or pressure accumulator failed, it wasn't a simple breakdown, it was a full systems failure. That meant you could lose your steering, suspension, and brakes in one cascading silent catastrophe. As one terrified owner recounted, one hydraulic line burst and I lost steering and brakes at the same time. Total panic. These weren't the kinds of failures you fixed with a wrench and some cursing. The Citroën SM required a specialist, a French-speaking priest mechanic with a garage full of green hydraulic fluid and decades of patience. In the US, the SM was both exotic and completely impractical. Citroën had no dealership network to speak of after withdrawing from the US market in 1974, and emissions and safety regulations forced awkward modifications. Parts were rare, diagnostic procedures often required disassembly of unrelated systems, and even towing one could destroy the suspension if done improperly. Mechanics unfamiliar with Citroën's logic often made things worse, not better. Stories of SMs sitting for years awaiting parts or repair became commonplace. And yet, when it ran, the SM was magic. It could cruise at 120 mph in absolute serenity, devouring Autobahn miles in silence and grace. The ride quality was dreamlike. Steering was telepathic. The interior, filled with quirky toggle switches, deep bucket seats, and a one-spoke steering wheel, felt like piloting a spacecraft. Motor Trend even named it Car of the Year in 1972, not because it was practical, but because it was extraordinary. The SM's downfall came from a combination of its complexity, Citroën's financial troubles, and the 1973 oil crisis. When Peugeot took over Citroën in 1974, the SM was quickly axed. Between 1970 and 1975, just under 13,000 units were built. Very few made it to the United States, and even fewer survived the years of neglect, botched repairs, and hydraulic heartbreak. Today, the Citroën SM is revered by collectors who appreciate its audacity, elegance, and vision. It remains one of the most ambitious cars ever produced, a machine that dared to be completely different and often paid the price for that ambition. To own one now is to embrace not just beauty, but risk. It's not a car you drive so much as one you commit to fully with your wallet, your sanity, and your soul. And yet for those who understand it, there is no other car that offers the same blend of engineering romance and design insanity. The 1985 and 1989 Yugo GV, short for Great Value, was perhaps one of the most infamously ridiculed cars ever sold in the American market, and for good reason. Imported from socialist Yugoslavia and marketed with almost laughable optimism, it was introduced as the ultimate bargain, a brand new car for under $4,000. On paper, that sounded like a dream. In reality, it became the butt of every automotive joke, a punchline on late-night television, and a rolling symbol of why cheap isn't always cheerful. Based on the outdated Fiat 127 platform, an economy hatchback introduced in Europe in the early 1970s, the Yugo was cobbled together in the Zastava factory in Kragujevac, Yugoslavia, and shipped across the Atlantic by entrepreneur Malcolm Bricklin, the same man who once brought Subaru to the US and later tried to sell his own gull-wing sports car. The Yugo GV, known as the Zastava Coral back home, arrived in America in 1985, promoted as a practical, affordable car for first-time buyers, college students, or anyone just looking to get from A to B without breaking the bank. The problem? It barely got to be. Under the hood was a wheezy 1.1-liter inline-4 making around 55 horsepower. 0 to 60 took over 14 seconds, assuming everything was working properly. And that was a big assumption. The 4-speed manual gearbox was clunky and fragile, and early models had such poor assembly tolerances that gear linkages would pop out unexpectedly. The carbureted engine often refused to start in cold weather, and even when it did, it was plagued with misfires, overheating, and inexplicable stalling. Reliability was so bad that some owners reported catastrophic engine failure within the first 10,000 miles. And that was just the powertrain. The build quality of the Yugo GV was abysmal. Door handles snapped off, dashboard plastics cracked under sunlight, trim fell off. The electrical system was a comedy of gremlins, horns that wouldn't work, lights that flickered like a haunted house, and radios that emitted only static. The paint was paper thin and offered zero rust protection. Some cars reportedly began to show surface rust before their first oil change. And when it came to safety, the Yugo was little more than a metal coffin. In crash tests, the structure crumpled like a soda can. It lacked any meaningful crash zones or reinforcements, and in real-world accidents, occupants were frighteningly vulnerable. One especially horrifying anecdote became legend among mechanics. I ran over a pothole and the wheel came off. The mechanic laughed when I brought it in. This wasn't just a case of a bad bushing, it was a suspension system so poorly engineered and so cheaply constructed that critical components could fail under completely normal driving conditions. Ball joints snapped, control arms bent, and struts collapsed. Driving a Yugo over American roads, especially in cities like Detroit or Pittsburgh with rough pavement and deep winter potholes, felt like Russian roulette on wheels. Despite all this, the Yugo initially sold surprisingly well. Its rock-bottom price point, around $3,000 now brand new, enticed curious buyers, especially during economic downturns. It even had a surprisingly large dealer network at first, and some dealerships were flooded with orders. But as word spread of its horrific reliability and tragicomic failures, public perception tanked. Lawsuits mounted. Warranty claims skyrocketed. Mechanics began refusing to work on them, either because they couldn't source parts or because they simply didn't want to waste their time. The jokes were endless. What do you call a Yugo with a flat tire? Totaled. Or, why do Yugos have rear window defrosters? To keep your hands warm while you push it. By the early 1990s, Yugo America had gone bankrupt, and the cars faded into scrapyard obscurity. By then, most had rusted away, broken down for good, or been totaled in minor collisions. Survivors became curiosity pieces, ironic icons of Cold War-era folly and misplaced optimism. You might see one at a Radwood show or stashed in the back of a Jalopnik editor's garage, but they're vanishingly rare on the road today. And yet, for all its flaws, the Yugo GV is remembered. Not for greatness, but for how spectacularly it failed. It remains a time capsule of 1980s globalization gone awry, proof that the cheapest option is rarely the best, and that sometimes you really do get what you pay for. Or in the Yugo's case, less than that. The 1976-1980 Saab 99 EMS electronic manual special was a bold Scandinavian stab at the sport compact segment, and on paper it had the right ingredients. A fuel-injected 2.0-liter engine, front-wheel drive, rally-bred DNA, and the idiosyncratic charm only Saab could deliver. The EMS stood out from the usual Japanese and American offerings of the late 70s with its wraparound windshield, hatchback practicality, an upright cabin that looked more like a cockpit than a car interior. It was high-tech for its time, capable, and genuinely quick, but it came wrapped in enough quirks and mechanical gremlins, to make ownership a thrilling gamble. With about 118 horsepower in the US trim, the 9 EMS was no slouch for the era. It had strong low-end torque and enough urgency to surprise V8-powered Malaise-era domestic sedans. Saab engineered the car with rallying in mind, and its front-wheel drive layout gave it incredible traction in snow or rain. But that torque came with a price: brutal torque steer. Under hard acceleration, especially in first and second gear, the car would violently pull to one side, as if it had a mind of its own. More than a few drivers found themselves wrestling the wheel when exiting corners or overtaking on narrow roads. Then there was the clutch. Though many Saabs of this era were built like tanks, the clutch system in the 99 EMS was notoriously fragile. Some drivers reported catastrophic failure with very little warning, a sudden loss of pedal feel, followed by the smell of burning clutch and a complete inability to shift. On a steep hill or busy intersection, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was terrifying. And the steering? Oh, the steering. Precise when it worked, the rack and pinion setup was known to suffer under stress. A few unlucky owners, particularly those who drove the car spiritedly, as Saab intended, experienced sudden loss of assist or even partial lockups in the middle of hard cornering. One former owner grimly recalled, "Great car," until the steering locked up mid-turn on a mountain road. It wasn't just a rare fluke. The design tolerances and quality control of some 99 EMS models simply couldn't match the demands placed on them. Ergonomics inside the 99 EMS were famously unconventional. Saab engineers, obsessed with safety and aircraft design, arranged switches and controls in bizarre places. The ignition key, mounted on the floor between the seats. The heater and fan controls, spread across the dash with no rhyme or reason. Even the glove box was an exercise in frustration. To the average American buyer, you're used to the simplicity of a Chevy Nova or a Ford Fairmont. The EMS interior felt like a strange Scandinavian puzzle. But perhaps most confusing of all was the Saab approach to mechanical design. The engine sat longitudinally, but was tilted at an angle, with the transmission mounted beneath it in the oil sump, a layout unlike anything else on the market. This setup gave the car good weight distribution and a low hood line, but made repairs a nightmare. Changing a clutch meant separating engine from transmission, an expensive job on a car already suffering from a weak service network and spotty parts availability in the US. Still, the 99 EMS had its loyalists. Rally fans, engineers, and iconoclasts loved it for its unique character, icy road confidence, and willingness to stand apart from the Detroit and Japanese herd. In the snow belt, especially places like Vermont or the upper Midwest, Saab was a badge of pride. You didn't buy one because you wanted to blend in. You bought one because you thought differently. And for those who could master its oddities and stay ahead of its mechanical failings, the EMS was a surprisingly fun and capable car. But time has not been kind to the Saab 99 EMS. Many succumbed to rust. Even Swedish steel couldn't hold off the salted American roads. Others were sidelined by failed clutches, busted steering racks, or complicated engine repairs. Today, surviving examples are extremely rare, often kept by Saab fanatics who rebuild them out of love rather than logic. Looking back, the Saab 99 EMS was one of those rare cars that managed to be both ahead of its time and hopelessly flawed. It offered sophistication, performance, and individuality, all tangled up in a package that demanded patience, expertise, and a tolerance for surprises. For every owner who sang its praises, another was stranded by the roadside, torquey steering into ditches, or wondering why their ignition key was on the floor. It was a car with personality, and like many personalities, not everyone could handle it. The 1980-1985 Renault Le Car was France's quirky attempt at cracking the American small car market. Rebadged and sold through AMC dealerships, it was essentially a US spec version of the Renault 5, a wildly popular European hatchback that had absolutely no business surviving on American roads. Small, cheerful, and painfully underbuilt, the Le Car was like an enthusiastic exchange student tossed into the middle of a football scrimmage. It was cute, nimble, and economical, but also terrifyingly fragile, sluggish, and out of place in a land of massive pickup trucks and 6-lane interstates. Powered by a 1.4-liter four-cylinder making around 55 horsepower, the Le Car was not fast. 0 to 60 took well over 15 seconds. And with the automatic transmission, the car felt like it was accelerating through molasses. Highway driving was more of a hope than a certainty, and overtaking required not only a long straightaway, but the kind of optimism usually reserved for people jumping out of planes. Hills? Best to just avoid them. In city traffic, it could dart around in tight spots, sure, but getting it up to speed was like coaxing a tired donkey with a carrot and a prayer. Its handling wasn't terrible as long as the weather was perfect and you weren't carrying passengers. But with its feather-light weight, narrow track, and tall body, it was disturbingly twitchy in crosswinds, especially on bridges or open stretches of highway. More than one Le Car owner reported needing to correct the wheel constantly just to keep the car in a straight line during gusty days. And don't even ask about what happened when a semi passed you at speed. The resulting turbulence could physically move the entire car a few feet sideways, turning the simple act of merging into a mini heart attack. Safety? That's where things really went sideways. The Le Car had virtually no crash structure to speak of. The body was thin steel, and the bumpers were cosmetic at best. In rear-end and rear-end collisions, owners reported rear glass shattering, hatch buckling, and even seat mounts giving way. One driver recalled, "Got rear-ended at 50 mph, the rear window shattered and the seat tipped back." That wasn't hyperbole. In crash tests, the Le Car performed poorly, with structural deformation occurring even in low-speed impacts. It simply wasn't designed for American-style collisions, and it showed. And then there was the build quality, or lack thereof. Interior plastics cracked under sunlight, the gauges fogged up, electrical gremlins haunted the car from day one, and the heating system was either boiling hot or freezing cold. Door handles broke off in winter, sunroofs leaked, and while the Renault 5 had been relatively reliable in France, the AMC assembled Le Car struggled with inconsistent parts sourcing, poorly trained mechanics, and a general sense that nobody at the dealership really wanted to be working on one. Yet somehow, the Le Car had a strange charm. It stood out. It had personality. It looked like a French cartoon come to life. All-round headlights, upright stance, and that unmistakable Renault grille. It was available in fun colors, and you could even get it with a sliding cloth sunroof and alloy wheels if you wanted to pretend you were in Marseille. It was beloved by college students, urban commuters, and people who just wanted something different, even if that something came with a long list of compromises. But the American market never warmed to it. It was too small, too slow, too weird. By the mid-1980s, AMC was drowning and Renault's foothold in the US was crumbling. Le Car faded from dealerships and eventually from memory, replaced by slightly more serious efforts like the Renault Alliance, which had its own problems, but at least looked vaguely modern. Today, surviving Le Car are unicorns. Most rusted away, blew head gaskets, or were crushed after one too many minor fender benders turned them into unrepairable pretzels. Collectors might snag one for novelty's sake, but daily driving one today would be an exercise in nostalgia-fueled masochism. Still, for the few who own them, the memories and the trauma linger. Like one former owner said, it was a fun car until the wind picked up. The 1977-1982 Alfa Romeo Alfetta GT was one of those cars that evoked more passion, frustration, and sleepless nights than almost any other vehicle in its class. It was a classic example of how Alfa Romeo, during its wild years of the late 70s and early 80s, managed to build a car that was, at once, a brilliant driver's machine and a mechanic's worst nightmare. It looked fast standing still, sounded glorious at full throttle, and handled with a poise that belied its era. But underneath all that Italian charm lay a deeply flawed machine, one that could thrill you one day and leave you stranded the next. On paper, the Alfetta GT was ambitious. It was based on the earlier Alfetta sedan's clever chassis design, which featured a rear-mounted transaxle for ideal weight distribution, a DD-on rear axle for better handling under power, and four-wheel disc brakes, a rarity in the mid-70s. The car was motivated by Alfa's 2.0-liter twin-cam four-cylinder engine, a rev-happy and soulful unit that produced a raspy, almost angry soundtrack that made mundane trips feel like laps around Monza. It was light, agile, and, when it worked, rewarded spirited driving like few of its peers. But those specifications didn't tell the whole story. In fact, they barely scratched the surface. The problem started with the build quality, which was famously inconsistent. These cars were not so much assembled as negotiated into existence. Gaps between body panels varied wildly. Electrical connectors were prone to corrosion within a year or two. Trim pieces had a bad habit of falling off while driving. The dashboards cracked from sun exposure, even in climates where sunshine was rare. The door locks froze shut in winter, while the power windows moved so slowly that you could run a lap around the car before they finished opening. Mechanically, the Alfetta GT was a masterclass in good ideas gone wrong. The rear transaxle was brilliant for balance, but made servicing the clutch a monumental task. To replace it, mechanics had to either remove the engine or drop the entire transaxle, both of which involved hours of labor, special tools, and a prayer to the Italian car gods. The drive shaft, which ran the length of the car, was mounted solidly to the body but had a rubber donut, guibo, at either end that frequently disintegrated under hard use, causing vibrations and eventually drivetrain failure. The brakes, though technically advanced, were another sore spot. Early models lacked proportioning valves tuned for real-world use, and hard stops often caused the rear wheels to lock up unpredictably, especially dangerous in wet conditions. Many drivers reported terrifying moments where the back end would suddenly leap sideways during panic braking, turning a quick stop into a heart-pounding spin. One owner recounted, "Every time I stopped hard, the back end jumped like a jackrabbit. It was like the car was trying to do gymnastics at 50 mph. But perhaps the most infamous issues were electrical. Alfa Romeo had a notorious reputation for its wiring at the time, and the Alfetta GT did nothing to improve it. Fuses melted, connectors corroded, and wires shorted seemingly at random. The taillights would go dark when you hit the brakes. The horn would occasionally blare without warning. Turn signals stopped working when the engine warmed up. And the dashboard lights? Forget it. They flickered like candlelight on a haunted ship. Under the hood, the engine was a marvel of character and sound, but only if properly maintained. And that was a big if. It ran hot in traffic. The twin-cam head was sensitive to oil starvation, which could happen if the oil pump wore out or the gaskets leaked, which they did often. Overheating was common and not always signaled by a functioning gauge. Radiators clogged, thermostats stuck, and cooling fans gave out without a hint. Many owners resorted to manual fan switches or aftermarket aluminum radiators just to keep the thing alive in city traffic. Interior ergonomics were another area of creative Italian interpretation. The pedals were offset to the right. The gear shift was long and rubbery. And while it had improved over time, early models had such vague action that drivers often ended up in the wrong gear. The ventilation system was laughably weak, the seats flimsy, and the heater controls seemed to work more as gentle suggestions than direct commands. Rust was the final nail in the coffin. Despite being coated in the optimism of the Alfa Romeo badge, these cars were not designed to resist the salt-laced winter roads of the Midwest or Northeast. Floor pans rusted through, rockers dissolved, rear wheel arches crumbled from the inside out. Trunk floors collected water and rotted from underneath. And because the structural rigidity of the unibody relied on those now disintegrating parts, crashes, even minor ones, could buckle the car in shocking ways. The 1946 Hyundai Pony is often remembered as the kind of car that both marked the beginning of Hyundai's journey in the American market and showcased just how difficult it can be for a foreign automaker to make a lasting impression. Introduced as an entry-level vehicle, the Pony was an attempt by Hyundai to capitalize on the American demand for affordable, no-frills transportation. It was a car built to be inexpensive, and that was exactly what it felt like. An afterthought in terms of engineering and design. If anything, it was a vehicle that got by on sheer price alone. And for many American drivers, that meant it was the only option they could afford. From the moment you laid eyes on the Hyundai Pony, you could tell that it was not made for the discerning car enthusiast. The exterior was basic, unremarkable, and almost generic. It had the kind of design that blended into the background, a look so devoid of character that it failed to make an impression one way or the other. It was a small hatchback with angular lines that didn't try to be flashy. Instead, it focused on function and economy over anything resembling style. In fact, you could walk past a Pony and barely even notice it, which was probably the best thing that could be said about its design. It was meant to blend in, to be unassuming. Underneath that basic exterior was a small, underpowered 1.6-liter engine that churned out a mere 70 horsepower. Now, 70 horsepower might be enough to get you around the city, but trying to accelerate quickly or merge onto highways was a different story entirely. The car struggled to keep up with traffic, and when it did manage to reach speed, it took forever to do so. It had an almost comical level of underperformance that frustrated anyone who had to drive it on anything more than city streets. One owner recalled, "I floored it to pass a truck on the highway, and it felt like I was watching paint dry. Merging was like playing a game of chicken with oncoming traffic." The car's lack of power was compounded by its inability to handle at higher speeds. It had no power steering, which combined with a stiff suspension, made it an exhausting experience to drive. The car seemed to fight you every time you took a turn, particularly at low speeds, where it felt heavy and unwilling to cooperate. On the highway, it felt prone to wandering, as if it had a mind of its own. In gusty winds, the Pony could sway dangerously from lane to lane, making it feel as though it was at the mercy of the elements. One former owner commented, "I could barely keep the thing straight on the freeway. A small gust of wind in the car would start drifting like a sailboat." But it wasn't just on the road that the Pony showed its shortcomings. The interior, like the exterior, was devoid of any real thought toward comfort or quality. The seats were thin, uncomfortable, and lacked the support needed for even short trips. The dashboard was an uninspiring, utilitarian affair, and the controls felt like they had been designed to be as cheap as possible. It had manual everything. No power windows, no power locks, not even a clock that worked reliably. The car was a bare-bones utilitarian machine with only the bare essentials, and even those weren't guaranteed to work as expected. For a car that was designed to be affordable, it didn't really excel in that department either. While the Pony was marketed as an economical car, It wasn't particularly efficient, and owners soon realized that it wasn't the kind of car you could just buy and forget about. The engine, though small, had a nasty habit of burning through oil at an alarming rate. One owner recounted, "I had to top off the oil every other week. I thought I was driving a lawnmower instead of a car." Add to that the frequent trips to the mechanic for basic repairs, and the Pony quickly lost its appeal as an economical vehicle. Despite its cheap price tag, it ended up costing more in maintenance and repairs than it was worth. One of the car's most notorious issues was its propensity for rust. It was a well-known fact that the Pony was not built to withstand the harsh conditions of American roads. The thin metal body panels corroded quickly, especially in areas with snow and salt on the roads. By the time many owners traded the car in or scrapped it, the vehicle had rusted out completely, with whole sections of the body disappearing into the ether. The car rusted out so fast, I swear I could see the metal turning into dust every time I drove it, one former owner noted. The rust was so bad that in some cases the car had more holes than solid bodywork. Then there were the safety concerns. The Hyundai Pony, like many economy cars of its era, offered little in the way of crash protection. There were no airbags, and the car's build quality was flimsy at best. In a collision, the Pony's thin metal body did little to absorb impact. In fact, the 1971 to 1973 Fiat 128 was one of the more ambitious attempts to bring European compact cars to the United States. But it quickly earned a reputation for being a rolling disaster rather than an automotive breakthrough. As the first mass-market production car to feature front-wheel drive (FREWD) in a transversely mounted engine, the 128 was initially seen as a step toward modernity. Unfortunately, its reliability and build quality were so far below expectations that it turned into a cautionary tale rather than a success story. The 128's compact design was innovative for its time, offering nimble handling and efficient use of space. Its FWD layout promised better traction and a more stable driving experience. Unfortunately, it was also built with the structural integrity of a soda can, as many owners would soon discover. The lightweight materials, while helping keep costs low, also contributed to an overall lack of durability that became apparent after just a few years on the road. Its body panels were thin and prone to rust, a problem exacerbated by the car's poor corrosion protection. Rust seemed to be the 128's constant companion. The door hinges often rusted off, leaving the car's doors hanging loosely and making it a struggle to keep the cabin sealed. The suspension arms, critical to the vehicle's ride quality and handling, had a nasty habit of cracking at the worst possible times, turning the 128 from a functional car to a barely drivable wreck in short order. Many owners were left stranded on the side of the road with broken suspension components or doors that wouldn't shut properly. However, it wasn't just rust and suspension failure that made the 128 notorious. It was also its tendency to catch fire. The Fiat 128's fuel lines were poorly constructed, and it wasn't uncommon for them to leak gasoline. In a worst-case scenario, those leaks would lead to flames shooting up from under the hood. The idea of driving a car that could spontaneously combust was, to put it mildly, unnerving. One former owner shared, "I parked it, came back 10 minutes later, and there were flames under the hood. It was like watching a slow-motion car fire happen right in front of me." The 128's electrical system was no better. Electrical shorts, particularly in the dashboard, were common, causing malfunctioning lights, wipers, and even the risk of electrical fires inside the cabin. When it wasn't catching fire, it was simply dead on the side of the road, often due to electrical gremlins that were a nightmare for mechanics and owners alike. Fiat's reputation for poor electrical reliability had already been established with other models, but the 128 brought the issue to a new level of frustration. On top of all of that, the 128 was not particularly fun to drive, despite its compact size and FWD layout. It was a car that was just as likely to frustrate as it was to please. The handling, while nimble at low speeds, could become unpredictable at higher speeds or during quick turns. The small engine had adequate power for city driving, but it lacked the performance to be truly engaging or satisfying on the highway. Driving the 128 was a chore rather than an experience, especially when it was dealing with constant breakdowns. Despite its obvious flaws, the Fiat 128 did manage to sell a fair number of units in the United States during its brief run. Its low price point and compact size made it an attractive option for drivers on a budget, but for anyone who relied on it for daily transportation, it quickly became apparent that you got what you paid for: an unreliable, poorly constructed vehicle that was more likely to cause headaches than provide dependable service. By the time Fiat discontinued the 128 in the US, its reputation was in tatters. It had a cult following among those who appreciated its European flair. But for most people, the 128 was a car that was better left forgotten. In hindsight, it was a car that tried to introduce new ideas to the American market, but did so with too many inherent flaws to ever make a lasting impact. As one owner put it wasn't just a car, it was a lesson in why cheap doesn't always equal value. The 1979 and 1983 Lancia Beta is one of those cars that enthusiasts often look back on with a sense of both admiration and regret. It was beautiful in its design, sleek, Italian, and full of character. But beneath that polished exterior was a litany of mechanical and structural flaws that made owning one a gamble. For many who were unlucky enough to experience its shortcomings, the Beta's charm was overshadowed by the constant barrage of repairs and breakdowns that ultimately ruined its reputation. When the Lancia Beta first hit the roads, it was widely praised for its good looks and its innovative features. Designed by Pininfarina, its elegant lines and sporty stance made it a standout in the crowded European compact market. With a front-engine, front-wheel drive layout, the Beta was both practical and modern for its time. It was available in several body styles, including a coupe, sedan, and convertible, which gave buyers a range of options, all wrapped in the kind of sophisticated Italian design that had made Lancia a name to be reckoned with. The interior, though utilitarian, was stylish, with quality materials and a focus on comfort. But while the Beta had all the right ingredients to be a success, it was plagued by mechanical and quality control issues that undermined its potential. The most notable problem was the engine mounts, which failed far too early in the car's lifespan. The engine mounts were prone to breaking or becoming misaligned, causing the engine to shift out of place. This not only led to rough idling and poor engine performance, but also contributed to more serious issues, such as the misalignment of the drive shaft and transmission. In some cases, this misalignment would cause the car to become virtually undrivable. One owner recalled, "I was on the freeway and suddenly I heard a bang. The engine shifted so badly that the front suspension literally fell out. It was like the car had been put together with duct tape." The structural integrity of the Lancia Beta was also a major concern. While it was a pleasure to drive on smooth roads, it didn't take much for the car's frame to start showing signs of stress. The Beta was infamous for its rust problems, particularly in areas where the salt from winter roads could accelerate corrosion. This wasn't just surface rust. Some Betas developed structural rust so severe that critical components, like the front subframe, would begin to collapse. The rust would weaken the car's frame to the point where it was no longer safe to drive, causing entire sections of the body to buckle under pressure. In one particularly tragic case, a Beta's front subframe collapsed while driving, sending the car into an uncontrollable spin. "I felt the car shake, and then the whole front end just collapsed. I could hardly steer, and I thought I was done for," said another owner. The quality control issues didn't stop there. Electrical problems were another headache for Beta owners. The wiring in the Beta was poorly insulated, leading to frequent short circuits and electrical failures. Dashboards would light up like Christmas trees, with random lights flashing on and off for no reason. The dashboard itself was prone to cracking and warping under the heat of the sun, and many owners found themselves battling malfunctioning electrical components within just a few years of ownership. The car's suspension, though well regarded when it was in working order, also suffered from wear and tear that could make the car feel like a rickety old go-kart. The shock absorbers were prone to leaking, and the suspension arms often needed to be replaced entirely after only a few years of use. When the suspension did fail, the handling could go from refined to downright dangerous in a heartbeat. A Beta with suspension problems could lurch from side to side in a way that made highway driving treacherous. The ride, which had once been praised for its balance and composure, quickly became uncomfortable and unpredictable. Another significant issue with the Beta was the engine itself. Though the car boasted a relatively powerful engine for its size, the motor was often underwhelming in terms of reliability. Many Beta owners reported that the engine would begin to burn oil at a higher rate than expected, leading to frequent top-offs and, in some cases, complete engine failure. One driver noted, "I had to add oil every 500 miles, and then one day the engine just died. No warning, no funny noises, just silence." The car's carburetors were also prone to issues, with fuel delivery becoming inconsistent, which would lead to rough idling and stalling in traffic. The combination of engine, structural, electrical, and suspension failures made the Lancia Beta a car that could be exciting to drive when it was running properly, but downright terrifying when it wasn't. For the price, it was an enticing proposition, an Italian sports car with flair, performance, and a certain level of elegance. The 1985 and 1989 Daihatsu Rocky was an interesting piece of automotive history. A compact mini SUV with a distinct look and off-road capability that endeared it to a select group of enthusiasts. But despite its off-road prowess and quirky charm, the Rocky was plagued by design issues that made it a dangerous proposition for everyday driving, especially at higher speeds. It wasn't so much that the Rocky was a terrible vehicle, it was simply a case of a vehicle that was poorly suited for the highways and fast-moving traffic that American roads demand. One of the most significant issues with the Rocky was its high center of gravity and narrow wheelbase. These two factors, in particular, made it a risky choice for anyone planning to drive it on highways or at speeds that exceeded the 45-50 mph range. At highway speeds, the Daihatsu Rocky had a tendency to feel extremely unstable, with the narrow wheelbase making it prone to twitchy handling. This is a common problem with vehicles of this size, but the Rocky seemed particularly egregious in this regard. The steering was overly responsive and light, making the vehicle feel unstable in corners. And when the driver wasn't paying close attention, it could easily lead to an unnerving moment where the car seemed as if it might flip. One owner shared their experience of driving the Rocky on the freeway. "I had a moment where I was just changing lanes at 60 miles an hour, and it felt like the car was going to flip. It was like trying to control a kite in a storm. The car would sway, and I'd correct the steering, but it felt like it was barely hanging on." That was the reality for many owners. A car that felt fine in the dirt, but downright frightening on smooth, fast highways. Beyond the handling issues, the Rocky was also burdened with a high rollover risk, particularly due to its high center of gravity. In a rollover scenario, vehicles like the Rocky, tall, narrow, and not designed with advanced stability systems, are notoriously dangerous. Several owners have reported moments where they felt like the vehicle was about to tip over, whether it was from a harsh maneuver or a simple lane change on the freeway. The Rocky's suspension wasn't designed to handle high-speed cornering or quick lane changes, so even a slight steering correction at 60 mph could throw the vehicle off balance. The result was a car that, while being capable of going off-road, simply didn't belong on highways. Another critical issue was the Rocky's lack of safety features. While off-road enthusiasts might have adored the vehicle for its durability in the wilderness, it offered little in terms of protection in the event of a crash. The safety ratings were poor, and the crash survivability was almost non-existent for those who were involved in a collision. This was especially problematic in light of the vehicle's narrow track width and high profile, both of which increase rollover chances. Safety tests, even those done in countries where the Rocky was sold, showed a disturbing trend. The SUV didn't hold up well in a collision, and occupants were at risk of injury in almost any crash scenario. One frustrated owner remembered their experiences, stating, "I just kept thinking, if I get into an accident, I might be in real trouble." When driving the Rocky, the concern wasn't just about how it handled on rough terrain, it was also about the overall stability of the vehicle in a crisis situation. Drivers who wanted a car to feel confident in while driving through dirt trails or sand dunes were satisfied. But those who needed a daily driver, especially one that could safely and reliably navigate highways, were left disappointed and often terrified. For some drivers, the lack of confidence in the car's stability led to early trades or even abandoning the Rocky entirely. It wasn't just the car's lack of advanced safety features, it was the very feeling of uncertainty that came with driving it at higher speeds. The Rocky was also one of those cars that had a cult following, yet was a vehicle that most casual observers simply couldn't understand. The off-road community loved it for its ruggedness and compact size. They saw it as a miniature SUV that could hold its own on rough terrain. The Rocky's small, simple engine and narrow body made it capable of climbing through mud, sand, and dirt with a minimum of fuss. However, once you removed it from those conditions, it quickly became a car with serious weaknesses. The cult following grew, but it was mostly among off-roaders who had found a small, affordable SUV that they could modify and push to its limits. However, driving the Rocky as a daily commuter or highway cruiser was an entirely different experience. The same characteristics that made it great for a weekend trail ride, its small size and tough build, became liabilities when driving on the fast-paced, high-speed roads of America. The high center of gravity made it a poor choice for anything involving quick. The 1975 and 1980 Peugeot 604, a full-size luxury sedan from France, was an ambitious attempt to take on the American market. With sleek styling, a comfortable interior, and a reputation for European sophistication, it seemed like a worthy competitor in the luxury sedan market. However, behind the polished exterior, the 604 harbored a series of significant flaws that made it a questionable choice for many American buyers. One of the most glaring issues with the 604 was its lack of compatibility with U.S. crash standards. Despite its impressive size and relatively solid construction, the Peugeot 604 offered little in terms of crash protection on American roads. Its design did not meet the rigorous impact standards required for American vehicles, making it dangerous in the event of a collision. The lack of proper reinforcement and crumple zones meant that in a crash, the 604 could offer little to protect its occupants. The vehicle's handling and steering system also proved problematic. A major issue for many owners was the frequent failure of the brake boosters. These components, essential for reducing the force needed to apply the brakes, would fail without warning, often in situations when the driver needed them most. Imagine driving at high speeds, approaching an intersection or exit ramp, and realizing that your brake pedal was nearly impossible to push down. In such moments, panic and loss of control were almost inevitable, and for many drivers, these brake failures were the cause of accidents that could have otherwise been avoided. Perhaps the most frightening mechanical issue with the Peugeot 604 was its power steering system. The steering racks in certain models were prone to sudden failure. Some 604s had a dangerous flaw where the power steering fluid would leak, and without warning, the steering would seize completely. Drivers would find themselves at the wheel of a car with no steering assistance, making it extremely difficult to control the vehicle, particularly at lower speeds when precision is key. One owner described the experience. "I was turning into my driveway one evening, and out of nowhere the steering completely locked up. I hit the mailbox with full force. I had no idea what happened." This was not an isolated incident. Several other owners reported similar experiences where the steering rack would fail unexpectedly, sometimes even mid-turn. For a car marketed as a luxury vehicle, this was a catastrophic flaw. The lack of power steering in such a large sedan made maneuvering nearly impossible, and the risk of an accident was significantly heightened, especially in tight spaces or while parking. Despite these serious safety and reliability issues, the 604 did have its moments of luxury. The interior was spacious and comfortable, with an elegant design that featured plush seating and a smooth ride when the car was functioning properly. But for many owners, the luxury experience was overshadowed by the constant worry of mechanical failures. The constant fear that the brake boosters might fail or the steering would seize at any given moment made the Peugeot 604 a stressful and unpredictable vehicle to own. The Peugeot 604's reliability, or lack thereof, also led to its reputation as a money pit. Repairs were costly and often required specialized knowledge of French engineering, making it difficult for many owners to find reliable and affordable service. Mechanics who were unfamiliar with Peugeot's peculiarities were often left scratching their heads, and parts could be difficult to obtain, especially as the car aged. Despite its potential, the Peugeot 604 quickly earned a reputation as a luxury sedan that could not be trusted. For those who owned one, the experience was a frustrating mix of comfort and fear. The mechanical failures, particularly the brake and steering issues, left a lasting impression on anyone who had the misfortune of dealing with them. In conclusion, the 1975 to 1980 Peugeot 604 is remembered not for its refinement or luxury, but for its reliability and safety issues that rendered it unfit for the American market. Its design flaws, from brake booster failures to steering rack issues, made driving the 604 an unpredictable and sometimes dangerous experience. For a car that promised European luxury and sophistication, the 604 delivered far too many headaches and dangers, ultimately leading to its downfall in the US market. It remains a cautionary tale for anyone looking for a blend of luxury and reliability, especially from a European brand that was not prepared for the demands of the American road. The 1980-1985 Zastava Coral, better known in the United States as the Yugo, is often cited as one of the most infamous vehicles to ever make it onto American roads. The Coral, a compact car originally from Yugoslavia, was marketed as an ultra-affordable, entry-level vehicle aimed at those looking to save money. But while it succeeded in keeping its price low, the Zastava Coral was also a rolling disaster in terms of quality and reliability, with a reputation that followed it to the end of its brief run in the US and US market. One of the first and most problematic issues with the Zastava Coral was its lack of proper anti-rust treatment. Without the corrosion-resistant coatings found in most modern cars, the Coral's body was prone to rusting almost immediately. The combination of a weak, thin metal body and subpar protective treatments meant that it didn't take long for the car's chassis to begin deteriorating. Drivers reported seeing rust spots forming in critical areas as early as a year into ownership. And by the time the vehicle was 5 years old, some cars were on the verge of falling apart. The braking system on the Coral was another weak point. Though the car's size and lightweight construction were meant to make it an easy vehicle to maneuver, the brakes often failed to provide sufficient stopping power. Drivers frequently reported that they had to press the pedal harder and harder to get the car to slow down, especially on downhill stretches. In some cases, the brakes would fade entirely, leaving drivers struggling to bring the car to a stop. One owner shared their frustration. "I had to pump the brakes just to get them to respond, and even then they weren't doing much. It was like driving a shopping cart with wheels made of rubber." Perhaps one of the most frightening and common issues with the Coral was its fuel system. The fuel lines were known to crack due to the heat generated by the engine, and this often led to fuel leaks. The engine's heat would cause these lines to become brittle over time, and in some cases they would crack or completely break, leading to fuel spilling onto the engine. This presented not only a fire hazard, but also a serious mechanical failure that could leave drivers stranded without warning. A driver recalled, "The car would stall out, and sometimes I'd smell gasoline. It was like playing Russian roulette every time I started the engine." Acceleration was another weak point. The Coral's tiny engine could barely manage to get the car up to speed, making merging onto highways or climbing hills a nerve-wracking experience. Most owners found that the car struggled to reach 60 mph, and even at full throttle, the engine seemed to lack the oomph necessary to move the car at a respectable pace. The underpowered engine combined with the unreliable fuel system and braking meant that driving the Coral was often an exercise in frustration and anxiety. But perhaps the most telling problem with the Zastava Coral was its inability to maintain any semblance of reliability. Multiple system failures were common. The car would stall at the most inopportune times, often in traffic or at intersections, forcing drivers to sit and wait while the engine refused to restart. The electrical system was often the culprit, with wiring failures, fuses blowing, and overall poor construction leading to a lack of power in critical components. One particularly harrowing experience for a driver involved the car dying at a red light. Mine died at a red light and wouldn't restart. I couldn't even open the hood to check the engine. It was warped. I had to wait 5 minutes before I could even get the latch to release. By that point, the car was just useless. In a crash, the Zastava Coral offered virtually no protection. Its lightweight construction and poor crashworthiness meant that in even a minor fender bender, the car's frame would bend and twist, potentially compromising the integrity of the cabin. In crashes at higher speeds, the lack of structural integrity, combined with weak brakes and a poorly designed suspension system, made the car a death trap. While the Zastava Coral, or Yugo, was a massive failure in the American market, it did have its fair share of supporters. The car was inexpensive, making it attractive to young drivers or those in need of a cheap vehicle. But even among those who didn't expect much from the Coral, the car's consistent inability to function properly led to widespread frustration. Some even joked that the Yugo was less of a car and more of a learning tool for mechanics, as the need for repairs was constant and expensive. In summary, the 1980 to 1985 Zastava Coral Yugo is remembered not as a piece of automotive history that made a significant mark on American culture, but as a cautionary tale about cheap cars that skimped on quality and reliability. Its lack of basic safety features, combined with mechanical and structural issues,